We do look funny a little bit on me.
We're live.
I can't really see the screen.
Thanks for coming. Thank you so much for being willing to pivot. Of course, now that we decided to move it in, it's been outside. But if we didn't do this, it would be off. So we're just gonna go with it. We are so glad to have Ron back, and this time talking about kind of a big thing, the 200th anniversary of the first wave of Norwegian immigrants, of which many came to McFarland. So Ron, thank you for pivoting and putting together a presentation, and you all enjoy.
No, thank you. I appreciate this crowd here. It's a bigger crowd than we would have had for our cemetery. Keep that to 15. But yeah, so I sent Sarah an email a couple days ago saying she doesn't really look. And for Thursday night, it's kind of so hot, it's going to be raining. So we made the decision to have it inside. And so I threw this PowerPoint together the last couple of days. And hopefully it'll work and be fine. But what I'm going to be talking about is just an overview of the Norwegian immigration, which started 200 years ago this month on July 4th. The first ship full of immigrants came from Norway to the United States. And so I'll give an overview of the first, then also after that, what happened, and what happened when they came to the United States. And then we'll talk about 11 or 12 families that came to McFarland or the McFarland area, even though there were a lot more than 11 or 12. It's just representative of folks. And so the first original group emigrated included 52 people. They're mostly Quakers and what they call Norwegians. Both groups were not happy with the state church of Norway, and they wanted their independence to do their own thing. And in Norway, that wasn't always approved by the state. And so they wanted religious freedom. So the first boatload of Norwegian immigrants were actually coming to the United States for religious freedom. And they came on this little what they call a sloop, called the Restoration. And it was built in 1801 under a different name, and then it was rebuilt sometime. It was rebuilt in about 1820 or so, and so I got the new name Restoration, which restored. And so 52 Quakers and Norwegians were on this boat, and their leader of the Quaker group was actually a sea captain. So he sailed the ship. But they didn't really know exactly what to do once they got here or where to go. Okay. And so they hired this man, Clayton Pearson, to help them with their states. And so they talked to him in 1821. He came over to the United States and just to scout out where the Norwegians, where these Quakers could go. And he spent some time here researching and walking all over the place. And then he went back to Norway in 1824 and had a meeting with the Quakers and told them, okay, I've got a good place for you to pick out. And so get ready to sail. And so they did, and they planned to leave in 1825. Clayton Pearson went ahead of them to get things ready. But so the small group of 52 Norwegians got on their boat and left at Stavanger on July 4th. And A sloop is a single-masted ship with multiple sails, and so it's quite small. And this particular ship was 55 feet in length and 16 feet wide. So it's very, very small. And so you had 52 people on this ship going across the Atlantic. And I should also mention that Clayton Pearson is also known as the pathfinder of Norwegian immigration, and he has a nickname of being the Daniel Boone of Norwegian immigrant. For 9, and so they were at sea for a little over 3 months. But they had quite good luck. Instead of 52 passengers arriving in New York, they had 53. They picked up an extra passenger. One of the women gave birth to a baby in September. But once they arrived in New York, they ran into some problems. I don't know if it's the harbor master or who was upset, but the ship was too small. They had too many people for a ship that size. And so that was one of the problems that they had. And that was against the American law at the time. So there was a severe fine. They confiscated the ship and the cargo, and they arrested the captain. Quite a bit of iron ore in their hull, thinking that they could sell it when they got to New York, and they could sell the ship and make the money back that they had spent on the ship. But they were stuck there for 5 or more weeks trying to figure out what to do, and the captain was their leader was in the jail. But for some reason, this problem went all the way to the White House, and President John Quincy Adams in November resolved the problem and pardoned the captain and rescinded the fine. And so that was all fine. So the Norwegians were ready to go, and they sold the ship and their iron, but unfortunately they got a lot less than what they had paid for it. And so they didn't have as much money as they hoped, but they got going. And Clayton Pearson had some land for them in upstate New York near Rochester, between Rochester and Lake Ontario. And so they headed that way. They went up the Hudson River, and then they got the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal had just opened in October, and so this group of Norwegians was one of the first groups to travel on the Erie Canal. The Norwegians were in Pearson had arranged for the New York Quakers to help the Norwegians feel at home and have housing and food. So things went rather well for them while they were waiting. A few of the original members of that ship stayed in New York, and 2 settled in Rochester, but the remainder of the group settled in Kendall, a township outside of Rochester. And for some reason, the land wasn't the greatest. It was very thickly forested, and it was so thick that very little light would come through on the north. And besides being so thickly forested, it was also very boggy and swampy. So it wasn't the greatest land. But anyway, they got busy chopping down trees to make room for. But they did as best as they could, and they stayed there for a while, for about 8 years. And then Clayton Pearson, thinking that they could have something better, went out on foot towards the west. They went through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Northern Illinois, searching for just the right spot that would be better than their settlement in New York. And he finally found what he wanted. It was in Northern Illinois, in LaSalle County, just a bit outside of what is today Chicago. And in 1934, 6 families from this settlement in New York followed Clayton Pearson to Illinois on this site along the Fox River. the rest of the original settlers, and the art followed fingers into Illinois. And this became known as the Fox River Settlement, the second Norwegian settlement in the country. And letters from these settlers started going back home to Norway because this site was really, really good, they felt. And so they were advertising to their family and friends back in Norway how wonderful this land was in Illinois. And as a result of those letters, in 1836, two sailing ships called the Norske and the Norden left Norway. They also sailed from Stavanger to New York, and they had 167 passengers. And so the immigration spigot was now wide open. These ships were just the second and third immigration ships coming from Norway. And so there was an 11-year period where nobody came organized manner. I'm sure there were some Norwegians during the 11-year period that came, but they probably went on a ship from Sweden or Denmark or England. But starting in 1936, immigration really started happening. 1836. Sorry. And so they started coming, by the hundreds, and the Illinois settlement soon was filling up. There wasn't enough room, so they started branching out. And in 1838, the first Norwegians came to Wisconsin in Rock County. Willie Knudsen Notstead arrived in Clinton Township in Rock County, and then more immigrants joined him, and the settlement became known as Jefferson Prairie, the first Norwegian settlement in Wisconsin. And then because more and more Norwegians were coming, then another settlement opened up called Mosquito. And this was formed in 1839. And so to understand Norwegians started leaving in the 36, 39 area, you have to understand Norway is a country. It's only 3% of the land is could be cultivated, and another 7% could be used as pasture. So there's very little farming land, even though the vast majority of the population earned its living from farming. And so it was a very rigorous life and poor economic conditions and scarce farmland. And there was also a class system in Norway at that time. And they kept the poorest people in poverty with very little hope for, going up the ladder for a better life. In Norway, between 1750 and 1850, the population doubled. And then again from 1850 to 1928. So with more and more people living in Norway, the chances of a good life there wasn't good for the poor people or the people who didn't own land. And then there was also the primogeniture law, where the eldest son inherited the land. So if your father had owned property, and if you were the second son, chances are you would not get any land to have a farm. So you were out of luck as well. So a lot of the people that maybe they came from a decent family wealth-wise, but they just didn't have a future because of the primogeniture law. And so these were internal factors pushing the Norwegians out, but then there's the external factors as well as the American letters that I mentioned. The Illinois settlers were writing home, so that was the pull from outside of Norway. So those were two very powerful forces leading to the immigration. See by this chart, it's 1836 on the very far left and 1928 on the very far right. And it has its ups and downs. Immigration has ups and downs, peaks and valleys. And the valleys are due to circumstances that were happening, like the Civil War, or in 1862, the Sioux uprising in Minnesota scared a lot of immigrants away that they would not come. And then in the 1873, 4 and 5, there was a major economic downturn in this country, possibly around the world. But so you get these peaks and valleys. And Jefferson Prairie settlement where Knutstead went in Rock County, and then Muskego over by Racine and Waukesha counties. And so they were filling up. And there was another settlement called Koshkanon, which is in southeastern Dane County. But it should also be noted that in the 19th century, 500,000 Norwegians immigrated to the United States. And then by 1930, it was up to over 800,000. And so it's not a big number compared to maybe like the Germans or the Polish, but in terms of percentage of your population, Norway lost more people than any other country except Ireland. So the Koshkanon settlement started in 1839, 1840, because people were filling up Muskego and they were looking for new land, and it had been heard that this area in southeastern Dane County was quite good. And then by 1850, approximately 12,000 Norwegians lived in the United States. Of that, around 9,000 lived in Wisconsin. Nearly 2/3 of the Norwegians in the United States lived in Wisconsin. And 1/3 of those in 1850. So Koshkanon is starting to be filled up, like 1839, 1840, probably in the very southeast corner of the county. And then they start filling up and they start moving up. And you can see McFarland that's on the very edge of the northwest edge of the Koshkanon settlement. And so Koshkanon is like Stoughton, Cambridge, Deerfield, Utica, Albion, and McFarland and all the townships around there. And so eventually, Norwegians started coming up towards McFarland. Focus on some of the Norwegians that came here. And I've talked in previous cemetery tours, I've talked about this couple, Ingrid and Helena Johnson. And they were the second and third Norwegians in the town of Gunn. And Helena's two brothers were the first Norwegians in the town of Gunn. They came in 1844 and settled here and started farming. Ingrid and Helena came in 1845 to the United States, but got as far as Buffalo, New York. They didn't have enough money to continue their westward journey, so they spent about 4 years in Buffalo working. And then they got enough money to continue their trip to Wisconsin, and Helena's brothers kept writing them saying, "Oh, come to Wisconsin where we are, and you can buy some land here." And so they showed up in 1849, and Helena's brothers sold them some land, and they started farming. And Ingebrigt then became pretty successful, and he bought more land in the town of Gunn, just on the other side of the Air River. They have a tract of land there. They have photos of the cemetery, so I grabbed these photos off of website planetgrave.com. But in 1970, Ingrid Johnson was interviewed by Stein Nielsen, who had the magazine, Village magazine in Madison. And so in 1870, Ingebrigt Johnson was relating his experiences as an immigrant, and this is what he said. I feel like this is going in and out. Is it okay?
You're good.
Okay. So here's what Ingebrigt Johnson said. I left Norway in April 1845, crossing the ocean on a ship, the Salvatore, from Porsgrunn. There were all told 140 immigrants aboard. Many of us had received letters from friends who had left earlier, and since they praised America, we also decided to look for homesteads beyond the big waters. As far as I could gather, it was these encouragements from America that had persuaded most of the immigrants who did old Norway farewell. The trip across the ocean was full of dangers. The fierce gales that we encountered on the Atlantic threatened us with death and destruction. The boat was loaded with iron, and during one fearful storm, the cargo got displaced, which nearly caused the ship to capsize. Even our experienced captain gave up hope of rescue. The terror and the cries of distress among the passengers were indescribable. After being tossed about on the ocean some 14 weeks, we finally reached New York Harbor in a miserable condition. So if you're on a small ship in the ocean for 2 to 3 months and meeting storms after storm, it's amazing how they made it and survived, and then how they would write letters back home, but still people kept coming. The Johnson family had 12 children, and I think 6 of them were born in Norway and 6 were born here. And so not only did they have to watch themselves on that terrible voyage, they had to take care of their 6 children that they brought along. But 2 of those sons served in the Civil War. One, Oliver, dying from disease in an army hospital in Memphis, and he's buried in the Gun burial site. And they had 3 grandsons who served in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, with one, Andrew, being killed in action at Luzon, and he's buried in the McFarland cemetery. And now we have Knut Holgerson Bailey and Knut's daughter, Asha. And Knut Holgerson Bailey is the son of Holger Torgerson Stordal and Ingeborg, Jan's daughter. And they immigrated to the United States in 1848 from Nisadal. And so the whole family came, Knut and his parents. And Knut's last name was listed in immigration records as Holgerson/Stordal. Somehow it was changed to Bailey. But Stordal, it means large valley in Norwegian. And take the Y off of Bailey, and that's Dala or valley. And he probably wanted people to pronounce, he wanted it to be pronounced Daily or Dali or something, and added the Y. And so now we have Knut Daly. Migrated first to Michigan in 1849 and in 1850 to California. Then coming to Wisconsin in 1851 and settling in the town of Gun. He met Gunhild, Knut's daughter, Torsheim, and she's from Seljord, Norway, and she immigrated in 1843 with her parents when she was just 8 years old. But they were married in 1855. Gunhild died in childbirth, and their daughter, also named Gunhild, died 2 weeks later. That was pretty typical of the Norwegian immigrants, that if someone died, like a mother or father died, but the child survived, they would name the child after their parent. But in this case, the daughter died 2 weeks later. The mother and the child are buried at the West Koshkonong Church, and the son, Knut, 15 years old, died 1 year later, and he's also buried at the West Koshkonong. 2 sons, Thomas and John, and Maria, lived until their adulthood, and both sons are buried next to their father in McFarland. According to Spine Nielsen, a Village magazine, in an 1870 report, Knut Daly was the wealthiest farmer in the town. And the sons attended the Daly Elementary School in the town of Dunn, named after the Daly family because their farm was right next to the school on Deerston Road. And later the school was called Hillside School. Johnson and Betsy Neil's daughter, Simon Johnson. And Torkel immigrated in 1857, leaving his home in Olstead, Gloucester, Southern. And he married Betsy in 1863. And Torkel is mentioned in a book, History of Dane County, Biographical and Genealogical, published in 1906. And so I'll just read what it says in that book about Torkel Johnson. Johnson is one of the prosperous and honored farmers of Dane County, being the owner of fine property lying in section 36, Blooming Grove Township, the area of the estate being 112 acres and all being in one body. Johnson was born in Soven in the province of Bergen, Norway, October 1830, and is the son of Johans and Jørgen Johnson, who passed their entire lives in their native land. Torkel Johnson received limited educational advantages in his youth and early learned the necessity and value of honest labor. He was a coastal sailor in the fair Norseland until 1857, when he determined to seek his fortunes in America. He arrived in New York City in due course of time, and his adventurous spirit soon led him to proceed still farther to the west and to learn the secrets of life on the frontier. He crossed the plains to California, making the long and tedious trip in company with a man named Charles Moore, and taking a number of horses which they sold at good prices after reaching their destination. Mr. Johnson then found employment in the gold mines, remaining in California for some time. He made the return trip by way of Aspinwall, United States of Colombia, from which point he crossed the Isthmus of Panama and took passage on a steamer for New York, the entire trip consuming about 2 months. He endured many hardships on the journey home, as he had also in crossing the plains, where there was at all times imminent danger of attack on the part of the Indians, while other trials and tribulations made the trip arduous in the extreme. Soon after his return from California, Mr. Johnson located in Vernon County, Wisconsin, where he remained 2 years, at the expiration of which he removed to Dane County, where he has since made his home. Here he purchased his present farm of 112 acres in Blooming Grove Township, while later he purchased the 60 acres adjoining in Cottage Grove Township. Of the later tract, he disposed several years ago, realizing a good profit on the transaction, having made excellent improvements on the property in the meanwhile. He has devoted himself faithfully and energetically to the development and improvement of his farm, and has made it's the same one of the fine places of the county, while his labors have brought to him the boon of independence. He is one of the thrifty and progressive farmers of this section of the state. He is a man of strong personality and marked intellect, and is held in high regard in the community which has been his home for so many years. In 1900, he visited his native land, renewing the association's childhood and youth, and finding much satisfaction on the trip, but having no desire to take up permanent abode there after his long and fruitful experience in the American Republic. Mr. Johnson is a Democrat in his political allegiance, but has never cared to take active part in political affairs. He and his family hold membership in the Norwegian Lutheran Church. On May 17, 1863, Mr. Johnson was united in marriage to Miss Betsy N. Syme, the daughter of Nels and Mary Syme of Cottage Grove Township, and they had several children. Speaking of Nels and Mary Syme, they're next. Nels Thorstein Syme was born in Syme Ardal community in the Sognefjord region of Norway. And he came to the United States in 1844 to Cottage Grove Township. And there he married, Mary Thomas' daughter in 1839 in Norway. They left Norway 5 years after being married. Immigration experience was written about in the history publication Norway in America by Martin Olsenstad. And it says, Nelson Maria Sign emigrated with 2 small children from Ardal in Sogn in 1844. They came by sail ship and were 14 weeks on the sea. From New York to Milwaukee, they traveled partly by boats drawn by horses through the canals and partly by steamboat. From Milwaukee, they walked for 80 miles. And when they finally reached Cottage Grove, they went into the forest where they found 4 trees that stood in a square. To these trees, they fastened some poles on which they threw some hay. So now they had a roof over their heads. There they lived until they were in a position to get a better house. They had no stove at first. They had to go to their nearest neighbors who were 3 miles away every time they needed to bake bread. They attended their first church services under the oak trees in West Koshkanan. Pastor Dietrichson was here on September 2nd, 1844, and served communion. This was the first church service in Wisconsin by Norwegians. They also took part in the building of the first Norwegian church there in the same year. These were Lutherans. One of their children, Thorstein Nielsen Sign, moved to Soldiers Grove in 1865, becoming a miller and a druggist. And he served as the sheriff of Crawford County for a number of years.
Was that Koshkanan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Knutson Deerland and Newhill, Cleft by Deerland. Ole Knutson is also known as Ole Knutson Kloppen, son of Knut Gunderson Kloppen. And maybe with that, I should try to explain for a minute the Norwegian naming conventions, which are little. So he's Ole Knutson, so that his father was Knut, and so he's the son of Knut. And Deerland or Kleppa or Kloppen, place where they were, where they lived, because of the farm. And so quite often when the Norwegians came, if their name was Ole Knutson Deerland, quite often they would drop the Deerland and only go by Ole Knutson once they were in America. But sometimes the families kept their Norwegian farm. But in Norway, Ole Knutson Deerland, if he stayed there and he was on the Deerland farm, maybe he would want to move, go to a farm 2 miles over that was much nicer. And then he would assume that farm name and drop the Deerland. So it makes it very difficult if you're in searching for family history and trying to trace your lineage, because they would change their name. But it makes it very difficult once they come here too, changing their name sometimes. Shelly or Telemark in Norway, and they married in June 1841, and 2 years later they immigrated to the United States, 1843. Ole Knutson Deerland was influenced to emigrate by letters written by Ole Knutson Okerbakken and by return visits to Norway by earlier immigrants. But Ole and Gunhild arrived at Muskego, the first large Norwegian settlement in Wisconsin. And here is what Deerland said about his early immigration experience in a Village magazine interview. So Ole Knutson Deerland said, Ole Knutson Strobatten from Lærdal sent many letters from America to his friends in Norway. He praised the country and championed immigration. Throughout all Upper Telemark, at this time, we heard much about America and Ole Knutson's letters. Many had their doubts, but Knut Svalestuen from Vinje returned to Norway for a visit. He had lived in the Norwegian settlement at Muskego, and his reports strengthened the faith of even the most dubious. Canute came back in the fall of 1843, and during the winter he was visited various districts in Telemark, seeking reliable information about the new land. The following spring, great numbers of people from the upper mountain regions streamed toward the sea to secure passage across the ocean. Many families, as well as single men and women, left Seljord also. 3 immigrant vessels sailed from Porsgrunn that spring. There were 211 immigrants on the ship I took. We went from Porsgrunn to Le Havre in France. From there, we secured passage on an American ship. After a successful voyage, we landed in New York and immediately set out for the west. The whole group stayed together until we reached Milwaukee. Up there, we broke up and everyone went his own way. My wife and I first went to Muskego. And so, Ole and Gunhild didn't stay in Muskego very long. So, Ole goes on to report. There was much talk of Kashkanan at the time. Many of the settlers had been west to have a look at the land, and they came back with good reports. For staying 2 weeks in Muskego, I too decided to choose Kashkanan as my future home. That fall, many of the older settlers left Muskego to seek new land near the West Kashkanan Church in Pleasant Springs Township. I lived for 6 years on Kashkanan. Niels Maastra and his brother owned much land in the neighboring township of Dunn, and when Niels offered to sell me part of it, I moved to my present place. At that time, the 2 Master brothers, Ingebrigt Johnson and some Yankee families lived in Dunn Township. Ingebrigt Johnson had arrived in the spring of 1849, while I came to Dunn in the fall of that year. Besides me, there were thus 3 Norwegian settlers living here. The next year, Hans Gudbrandsson Morkebolden from Newendal arrived, and still a year later, the population increased considerably because of immigration. And so the town of Dunn is starting to fill up. In Ole Dearland's obituary, it said that he was always a happy, contented fellow and could tell many interesting stories about pioneer days. He died of lung fever and pneumonia. And Ole and Gunhild had 2 daughters, and one Hattie married Dearson and farmed in the Dearson farm. And the other was Julia, who married Peter Johnson, a well-to-do farmer in the town of Dunn. And so the next immigrant that we're going to see is Bjorn Amundsen Standal and his wife Gunhild Olsdatter Bergelind Standal. Bjorn Standal was known as Bjorn Asmundsen Nestastua, and somewhere along the line he took the name Standal. And he's from Vinci in Telemark, being born on the farm Nestastua in Borgerend in 1823. On the ship in Vinterflid from Porsgrunn in the spring of 1843. They were 11 weeks on the ocean before reaching New York. He continued on to Milwaukee and the Muskego settlement. Here, he and other immigrants stopped during the winter with an American by the name of Putman, with 7 persons in a hut that was 14 feet long and 10 feet wide. In the spring of 1844, he walked west to Kashkanan, where he decided to buy 80 acres of land in section 32 in southern Cottage Grove, and began the occupation of the farm. 4 years later, he married Gunhild Bergman. Bjorn Standal died in April 1906 from pneumonia at the age of 83, survived by his wife and 9 children. At the time of his death, he had a farm of 250 acres. His obituary in the Wisconsin State Journal stated that Standal was one of the substantial citizens of his community, industrious and respected, and his going has removed one of the oldest and best known settlers of eastern Dane County. And on his tombstone, this at a previous cemetery tour, there's a hymn verse etched into his gravestone, and it's the words to his favorite hymn. And it was actually it was written. The composer wrote it, hoping that it'd be the final verse of a mighty fortress, but now it's a standalone hymn in the hymn. He married the grandson of the McFarland's first full-time minister, Ralph Grant. And grow Ellisted. They both were born in Valdres, Norway, and they were married in Norway and started a family. The family immigrated in 1840. They lived at Oakland, sailing on the Statsrad boat ship, and they left from Bergen. They had 4 children with them on the voyage. They arrived in New York City on July 4th after a 2-month journey. They eventually made it to Blooming Grove, where they purchased a tract of wild land in Section 23. It was heavily wooded, so a great deal of work was needed to make the land livable. With the timber that was cut down, Johannes built a cabin for the family and started farming. Milwaukee was the nearest market, so the harvested grain had to be hauled by a team of oxen. It was a slow and torturous journey, taking 1 week each way. Grain was ground into feed and flour, and some of it was sold for cash. Grow, or going by her Americanized name Grace, parted the wool, spun the yarn, and wove the goods at home, from which she made much of the children's clothing, using a loom made by her husband. Johannes, learning the shoemaking trade in Norway, made all of the children's shoes. Over the years, more and more land was added to the family farm, ending with 400 acres. At the time of her death in 1909, Grove had 8 of 11 children still living, 70 of 85 grandchildren, 69 great-grandchildren, and 1 great-great-grandchild. And so sons Nelson and John divided the homestead, and another son, Peter, fought in the Civil War for the Wisconsin 15th Infantry, and after the war he moved to Iowa. And their offspring became quite prominent and successful over the years. And now I think there's 7 generations in the McFarland area of the Ellisteads. Well, Holber Fossen, also known as Holber Lorentzen, and Jorund Lawrence Fossen. Jorund was born in Seljord, Telemark, baptized on June 7th, 1808. They were married in 1838 at Seljord, Telemark. He had been married once before, marrying Knut Leifson Fossen, age 69. 10 months after they were married. And so Jorund found Holber and they got married. And they immigrated in 1843 on the ship Lorraine. In the book, A History of Norwegian Immigration by George Flom, it says that Holber Fossen was one of the earliest Norwegian settlers in Pleasant Springs. He and Jorund came to Racine County, or Mexico, or the Muskego settlement, to rest from their travels for a few weeks before heading to Cushman. They were guests of Stephen Hegg, who was the father of Hans Christian Hegg, the Civil War colonel who now his statue's up on the square. They finally arrived on Cushman Prairie in the later part of September, having walked from Muskego. Halverson, who had been born in Norway, married Tollef Olsen Fossheim, who became one of the wealthiest farmers in the town of Dunn. And Tollef purchased the Larson house in 1901, but unfortunately Ingeborg died in 1903, and Tollef didn't want to live in the house, the Larson house by himself, so he moved in with his daughter, who lived in Stoughton. But the family still owned the Larson house, but they sold it after Tollef's death in 1910. And so in 1911, it was sold to John and Julia Larson. And Holber Fossen's obit, it says he helped organize and build the first Lutheran church, the Western Church in Wisconsin. History. And that I think we have to talk about this family as well, because all the people born or buried in the cemetery the vast majority just don't have a whole lot of information on it. You don't know the backstory or maybe where they came from or what they did for a living. And so this is kind of a typical, but it's a very nice headstone. But I don't even know, I'm not sure of their names because it just says father, mother, and brother. And the interesting thing is they all died in the same year. And I don't know if it was the same date or near one another. Did they die from a disease or was there a tornado or a fire or something? And I searched, and I could not find any reports in 1880 of a tragedy striking this family. But I know they're Norwegian because in the writing at the bottom of the headstone, it says it's in Norwegian and it translated means blessed are the dead who die in the Lord. And so I kept looking, and possibly it might be Ole Olsen, his wife, Johanna Jacob's daughter. And they were married in 1865, but I can't swear to it that this belongs to them. But they had a daughter, Mathia, born January 6, 1866. And so she had been the one who eventually erected this headstone for her parents and her brother who died in 1880. And so I found Mathia Croak in Gullickson, who was buried in Stoughton, and she was born in 1866. And she may have just changed that from that G to a K, but I don't know for sure. But it's just one of the mysteries of any cemetery and any immigrant. Immigrated to the United States in 1854. And Amon was buried in McFarland Cemetery, according to the Stoughton Career Hub. But they have him listed as Gunderson instead of Scary. But the important thing to know is that Anud and Helga had several children, and one was Ole Amundsen Skari, and Ole Amundsen Skari with his wife Ragnhild raised 10 children in a cabin on Hidden Farm, a cabin that's now. And so Ole Anderson Skari and Ragnhild are both were born in Norway. Skari and all his siblings, and because of Albert Skari, McFarland Historical Society was able to get a huge part of their collection to start their museum. One interesting thing about Anud, before he immigrated, he was in the Norwegian army, and Norway was ruled by Denmark for about 400 years, and Denmark was an ally of Napoleon. But Napoleon, with the wars happening, Napoleon lost, and because of that, Denmark lost. And so Denmark had to give up Norway because of being on the losing side of the war. And instead of giving Norway independence, powers that be gave Norway Sweden. And Norway didn't like that a whole lot. So there was a little war going on between Norway and Sweden because of this. We called it the Swedish-Norwegian War of 1814. And so Anu Gunnarsson Skari was in the army during this time, as part of the Norwegian army. But Sweden won that battle, but Norway still was able to have their own constitution. Part of the agreement was that Norway and Sweden would share the same king, which was the Swedish king, which they wrote on May 17th, 1814, which is what we celebrate on the 7th of May. But the union between Sweden and Norway lasted until 1905. And then Norway finally got its independence. Here we have Ole Olsen Aaron and Murray Tegan Aaron. Ole Olsen was born in Oslo, Luster, the southern fjord area. He was the son of Ole Ernest, and he married Anders daughter June 8th, 1835 in Oslo, Luster. So. And they were the parents of at least one son and 8 daughters. And they immigrated to the McFarland area. Marie's obituary in 1908, it stated that Marie was a very active woman despite her great age, being a regular attendant at church when weather permitted, and she was a tireless worker even to the last, being busy with her knitting within a week of her death. She was a good and kind neighbor, always ready to aid in sickness and trouble. And so this is another of the Norwegian families that stayed in the area for generations, leaving a lasting and meaningful impact on the local history of the Parkland area. And this was in the cemetery tour. This was going to be the last that I was going to stop at, because we come around in a full circle now, because one of their daughters, Ingeborg, or Belle, married Oliver Johnson in 1910. And Oliver Johnson was a grandson of Ingeborg and Helena Johnson, who was the first grave that we were talking about. And so the Norwegians' impact on local history in McFarland area is subtle but meaningful, especially within the context of early settlers and immigrants. And these people that we talked about today are just a few of who helped shape the agricultural, business, and cultural landscape of McFarland. And with that, I'll take questions.
The practice of the oldest son getting the entire farm, or do they Americanize the?
Yeah. Now the question is, once they settled here, did they continue the primogeniture law where the oldest son gets the land? And no, I don't believe they maybe some old-fashioned farmers might have, said, okay, you're the oldest son, you can have the farm, but not as a regular practice.
There was more land here too.
Yeah,
Farms.
yeah. And like the Ellisted family, 2 of the sons split the land, and but there was a lot of land in that follow that precisely that law.
In your research, Roger, have you run across any kind of accounts of interactions or conflicts with the Native Americans here?
Not really. A few that I've read about, the Dearsons for one, I think there were a couple other families, all said they had wonderful relations with the natives in this area, because, well, when the settlers arrived in the 1840s and 1850s, the Ho-Chunk had been removed, but then they would come back.
Yeah.
And they would peacefully live along the river or in the woods. And most of the farmers I had here were gracious with them, and likewise the natives were gracious with the settlers. So I never saw or heard of any negative.
Farmers acquiring more land, there'd be a limit on how much a man and his wife could farm.
Yeah.
Before they had farm machinery.
Yeah.
Did they wait till they had children old enough to Have more land, and buy more land.
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but I think some just had how they got their money. Uh, They just had good crops and a good harvest and started accumulating money and just felt like, okay, I'm gonna get as much land as possible. Thinking, okay, I'll have some sons down the road, or my sons are getting older to help. I don't know how some of them made it really big and others struggled.
Well, I think some of them had hired hands. And that was a practice also of sending a teenager over from Norway
Yeah.
to be a hired hand.
Yeah, that's true. And quite often the Norwegians settled where they were familiar with people from their hometown or that district. And so they would, correspond before they immigrate and say, can I, spend a year or so with you before I move on? So that's true. They'd work for the farmer and get their feet on the ground, get some money, and then maybe move further west to buy available land. And that was a personal story with my family. My great grandfather came over. It was 1880s in the western Minnesota. Started working as a farmhand with a man from his home area in Norway. And my great grandfather was probably expecting to be there for 2 years and then get enough money to buy his own farm. But as luck would have it, the farmer died. And my grandfather eventually married the farmer's widow. So so luckily for me, the farmer died. Yes.
There's a picture of a whole family. Kitchen of Larson house and 10 children. And that was pretty typical.
Yeah, big families. Yeah, they realized they needed big families. And the life expectancy, I don't know what it was, but one thing that's, I think, typical of these people that I was reading about have been at large. So many of their children would die. And so they just kept having more children to make sure that they would have the offspring that help them.
But with the many of the people that lived to the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
I have another question, Ron. I've always been curious, how did tobacco become crop here? I wouldn't think that Norwegians in Norway would be raising tobacco.
No. I've always said that the Norwegians were the crazy ones, to take on tobacco because it's such a backbreaking, labor-intensive crop, and nobody else really wanted to do it. But the Norwegians did raise a lot of tobacco. The need or
There was a market.
the market for it, yeah, and it was a pretty cash crop, and a lot of people could, from their tobacco crop, take care of certain expenses very easily.
Didn't Denmark basically rule both those countries for a long time? How did Sweden get independent of Denmark and then take like Norway?
Yeah, I don't know about Sweden and Denmark, but yeah, Norway was by Denmark for about 400 years. And the Norwegians call it the 400-year night. And it was a fun time. But I don't know about Sweden, how they got away from Denmark. But yeah, there's a interesting history between those three countries over the years. It's interesting to know that Norway is not that in terms of an independent country.
I noticed in some of your photographs that some of the tombstones look pretty new, you know, in good shape. Is that surviving family that maybe purchases a new headstone or or is just the materials made out of?
I'm not really sure. I know currently the Cemetery Association and some of the American Legion are at the cemetery often cleaning the headstones. But like that one headstone of the Krugman family looked very new. And they died in 1880, but I'm sure it wasn't erected until much later, but I don't really know the story about that. So sometimes I think a family will put up a newer headstone years after their grandfather or grandmother died. But I think a lot of it now through the Cemetery Association taking care of headstones.
These are these modern. And that it's often some that
Yeah, I'm not sure. But these white ones with the inscriptions on the headstones are very hard to read sometimes. But then once the Cemetery Association will wash it and clean it, sometimes the inscription pops out better. Any Norwegians here? Yeah. Well, I like the one where I mentioned Billet magazine often. That's in a title called Chronicler of America, I think. But that publication is from the Norwegian American Historical Association, St. Olaf in Northview, and there's Peter Rick Johnson and Deerland were from that book, and then there's a lot of information about McFarland, the Conagons, and Pleasant Springs in that particular book. One good place to go if you're interested, and I've got little bookmarks here. The Norwegian American Genealogical Center and the NICE Library, which is in Madison, and they have a library there with every kind of Norwegian immigration book that they read, and a lot of this information. It's not it's I can't even remember what it's called, but it's Norwegian genealogy, and it's like a 5-volume series from 1825 to 1850, and it just lists the various people who immigrated and their basic information, where they grew up, or who they married, what ship they came on. But it's not easy to find. But they also have a database online, and if you're a member, you can search the database. But then there's some old books too that I titles right offhand, but like that graph I showed at the beginning, that chart with the up and down. I really like that. 25. So it's not up to date, but it has the early information. And then I can't remember the actual name in Norwegian, but it's been translated. So it's just basically Norwegians in America. And it's at the library. And that's a really good one. It's 3 volumes.
A couple days ago, a good friend of mine from Milwaukee was over. We were visiting, and she has done a lot of research into her heritage and so on. And she was at the conference at St. Olaf about a month ago. And she said one thing that was stated at that conference, which both of us had a hard time believing. She said that of the Norwegians who came over and immigrated, only about 25% of them remained with, which I thought was it just that sounded off base.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right to me either.
Yeah,
I don't know if they're how far out they're going, maybe year 2025.
oh,
I don't know, but I think, yeah, I think the Norwegians helped highly. The Norwegian immigrants in the first, second, third generations helped highly to the church and the Lutheran church.
Yeah, so I'm going to direct this wonderful collection of books and maps and, you know, the text, not artifacts, just, materials that, it's really amazing. So, I know we've got the ISHP, you know, histories and histories from all of the local historical societies. And of course, also visiting our museums. You know, they-
Yeah.
it's part.
Yeah. I just wanted to quickly say that if you're interested, the restoration, they built a replica of it, and it's on its way over to the United States right now. It left Stavanger on July 4th, and so it's
Oh,
replicating the initial voyage. So it's going to show up in New York on October 9th. But you can follow online. Just go to restoration.no and they'll take you to their website. And I think you can see where the ship sweeper is. This voyage. And I think they're on Facebook as well. Yeah. So that's always so, but those dates are easy to remember. That was July 4th, of course, 4th of July, it's easy for us to remember. And it arrived in New York on October 9th. And for the people who are into Norwegian history and whatnot, or North American history, October 9th is Leif Erikson Day. And so that's why Leif Erikson Day is on October 9th, because the restoration arrived in New York on October 9th. And so I think it was 1927, Wisconsin became the first state to have an official Leif Erikson Day observance day. And because of the restoration arrived 102 years before. So I do appreciate you all being here and listening.